I thank Women in Gender Studies. Sarah Friat is here. Don't know if I see anybody else. And Professor Yuli Restovo, who will also be joining us for dinner. And Dean Lonas, thank you for coming. And yeah, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker for the day. So Michael Dango is an assistant professor of English and Media Studies at Beloit College, USA, where he is also affiliated with Critical Identity Studies. He is the author of Crisis Style, The Aesthetics of Repair, which came out in 2021, which theorizes how stylistic developments in contemporary US literature, music, and visual art respond to a sense of pervasive crisis. His writing also regularly appears in forums such as Public Books, New Inquiry, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and art forums. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Dango.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Cool. Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm really excited to spend some time with you. I wanted to start by thanking Professor Khandelwal for all of her incredible labor in organizing the series and for bringing me here today. I know that a lot of work goes into that sort of thing, and thank you also to Tampa for all of the administrative assistance bringing me here as well. It's been a really fun day getting to meet some students, getting to see your beautiful campus, and like I said, I'm excited for our time together this afternoon. So as you can see, my talk today is titled Why We Need Contemporary Art to Understand Sexual Violence. And so I should mention from the beginning that we'll be looking at a few works of art together today related to this topic. We'll be looking at three artists in particular, all of whom can in some way be thought of as sculptors, although maybe not necessarily in a traditional sense. These are Mona Hatoum, a Palestinian artist born in Beirut and now working in London, Nikki Luna, an artist born and based in the Philippines, and Tanya Candiani, an artist born and based in Mexico City. From their careers, I won't be showing any work that depicts acts of rape or that kind of has graphic visual depictions of sex or violence more broadly. But I will be talking about rape in a cultural context, like what social and institutional forces cause it and can prevent it. And if any of this discussion today causes you any anxiety, I would really encourage you to feel free to get some air, take care of yourself at any point during the talk. In the hour that we have together today, I might not be able to convince you about the claim that's in my talk's title, that art is indispensable for the movement against sexual violence. But I hope to at least demonstrate to you how certain contemporary works of art are actively theorizing sexual violence at a structural level. By a structural level, I mean something that is greater than individuals. I mean the social, political, and economic conditions that make sexual violence possible, as well as the social, political, and economic conditions that make sexual violence invisible. For instance, that make rape a crime vastly underreported relative to other crimes, like robbery. Art is particularly important for thinking about these structural forces because art, especially sculptures, which again will be my focus today, always operate at a certain level of abstraction and generality. Even traditional sculptures, like Michelangelo's David, for instance, perhaps the most famous sculpture in the world, even traditional sculptures that are supposed to be modeled after a specific human being are also trying to tell us something more abstract, like what beauty is, or what heroism is. And when sculptures are visually abstract too, to begin with, so these kind of sculptures you might be familiar with that are just kind of abstract collections of shapes, for instance. When sculptures are interested more in concepts and shapes than in photographic representation of something real, then they may be even more invested in helping us see something that is otherwise hard to visualize, like gravity or happiness or power. And in this way, operating through abstraction, we will see that art provides a vocabulary for talking about sexual violence that is different from the two other vocabularies that otherwise dominate contemporary discussions of sexual violence. These discussions have proliferated in the past half-decade, fueled by the Me Too movement, the Harvey Weinstein allegations, among other things, beginning in 2017, as well as an international women's strike beginning in 2016. And when we talk about sexual violence, there are two main vocabularies we tend to draw upon. The first is legal. When we think about sexual assault, we often think of it as a crime. We think of who is a victim, who's a perpetrator. We want to know if someone is guilty and what punishment they should receive, and we want to know if that punishment is justified. And to know if someone is guilty, we have to know about individual intentions, whether a victim consented or whether a perpetrator knew they consented. To know if a punishment is justified, we have to know how much money a perpetrator has to pay, or how much time in jail they're going to spend. And on this front, the Me Too movement has advocated for more serious punishments, for instance, to show that our culture is taking sexual violence seriously enough. This legal vocabulary works at primarily an interpersonal level. It's adjudicating case by case what happened between two individuals. And it deals out justice at an individual level too, so that the success of the Me Too movement becomes judged by how many Harvey Weinsteins it sends to jail. The other vocabulary we tend to draw upon in contemporary discussions of sexual violence is a public health vocabulary. If law works at an interpersonal level, public health works at a population level. This is the vocabulary that gives us phrases like 1 in 5 women, for instance, referring to the incidence rate of sexual violence victimization among women in the US population over the course of a lifetime. These statistics come to us from huge surveys like the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which was launched by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, in 2010. Over the course of the later 20th century, the CDC and other public health institutions noticed that some diseases had been virtually eliminated by scientific intervention, such as the development of vaccine for polio. But many have been prevented by the promotion of lifestyle changes, like the prevention of lung cancer through quitting smoking. And analogically, public health officials reasoned that widespread violence too, as one of the leading causes of death in the United States, could be conceived of as a social problem on the level of an epidemic, like a disease, and prevented, like other diseases, by changes in lifestyles and the cultures that promoted them. Disease prevention, including sexual violence prevention, thus became primarily an educational problem. And that's why almost every freshman college orientation now includes some sort of training about consent or healthy sexuality and the like. So we have law and we have public health. And when we talk about sexual violence, I want to argue that we almost always are drawing from one of these two vocabularies. But neither of these were the vocabularies that US feminists originally drew upon when they politicized sexual violence for the first time in the 1970s, the decade that held the first rape crisis speakouts, the formation of the first rape crisis centers, as well as events like Take Back the Night, which I think those marches continue to happen on college campuses today. Many feminists at this time were particularly distrustful of the law for talking about sexual violence. In consciousness-raising groups, women sharing their experiences realized that rape was most commonly perpetrated by acquaintances of a victim, including abusive husbands, entitled boyfriends, and aggressive dates. But the law and the police didn't usually care about these rapes. In most states in the 1970s, marital rape, rape within marriage, wasn't even illegal. The assumption was that in marrying a man, a wife had provided lifelong consent to sex. So there was a vast sphere of sexual violence that was entirely invisible to the law. And before turning to the law then, feminists thought we needed to analyze what was going on in our culture that made sexual violence so invisible to begin with. What stories, norms, images circulating in our culture made rape so pervasive among women and yet so hidden in the public? In turn, the leading texts of the 1970s anti-rape movement were works of literary and cultural criticism. Kate Millet's Sexual Politics, 1970, diagnosed rape culture through close readings of authors D.H. Lawrence, Norman Mailer, and Henry Miller, and found the start of a better culture in the French author Jean Genet. Sylvia Wynter's essays in this period analyzed the colonial origins of gender through close readings of writers from Shakespeare to the anti-colonial writer Frantz Fanon, and she called for what she named an aesthetics too that could transculturally reprogram forms of life in more egalitarian terms. Susan Brownmiller's Against Our Will, the most widely read text about rape, First introduced the idea of what we now know as rape myths by analyzing literal Greek myths and connecting them to sexual violence today, like the rock and roll sound lyrics, for instance. Before joining Catherine McKinnon's anti-pornography legislation, Andrea Dworkin's first book, Woman Hating, used literature to examine misogyny and to develop an androgynous counterculture. And the groundbreaking anthology, This Bridge Called My Back, used experimental forms of writing to address the pervasiveness of violence against women of color. It's from this groundbreaking work in the 1970s that feminists developed what we might call a third language for talking about sexual violence. This third language is an aesthetic language. It's the language that gives us many powerful phrases that are still with us today. This vocabulary, from the literary idiom of the myth to the visual culture idiom of like the male gaze, for instance, was focused not on an interpersonal level, like the law, or even a population level, like public health, but a cultural level, captured in the very phrase rape culture, another phrase that's invented at this time. Because it was culture, the stories we tell, the images we consume, the music we grind to on the dance floor, that determine what we might almost instinctively think and feel about sexual violence, including what events even count as sexual violence. An important feminist ambition in turn became transforming culture, changing those stories and images and songs. So let me return for a minute to that question of marital rape, which was not conceived of as rape in the early 1970s. One of the reasons marital rape didn't count as rape in the public imagination was because it wasn't the dominant genre of stories that we tell about sexual violence. A genre means that you and I both know what a story is about and feels like before someone tells it. So if I say, we're going to go see a Marvel movie or stand-up comedy or a slasher movie, we both kind of know what it's going to feel like. We probably even know how the movie's going to end before we watch it because we've kind of absorbed those conventions of genre. Genre, in other words, is loaded with cultural norms that are bigger than you and me, but which you and I have internalized so deeply that they feel like common sense. For much of the 20th century, the dominant genre of sexual violence in the popular Anglo-American imagination was the strange man who assaults a woman in the dark alley or jumps out of the bushes at night. What made these scenes of violence generic, a genre, was that no one had to actually know someone who had been assaulted in such a way, in such a place, but all of us were familiar with the outlines of that story and what it meant. What it meant is that rape was something that happened at night, which made it allegorically opposed to everyday normal life. It was something that happened in public, and especially in cities, places with alleyways and public parks to begin with. Because of the way the cities are racially encoded, the rapist was probably a person of color. And because rape was a crime, the problem of rape was a problem for police to control, monitor, and prevent, including, if necessary, over-policing and criminalizing communities of color. In other words, stranger rape has an affinity for police propaganda. It is a problem, we are told, for which we need the police to solve. A significant ambition of the feminist movement in the 1970s was to shift this dominant genre of sexual violence in the popular imagination. Like I said, in consciousness-raising groups, women discovered that rape was most likely to happen in scenes much more familiar and literally closer to home than the alleyway or the public park. They revealed that most women had known the men who had raped them, spouses, boyfriends, dates, and because romantic relationships primarily formed within racial groups, rape too was primarily an intra-racial problem, not an inter-racial problem. Rape wasn't symbolically opposed to the everyday, but formed part of the common texture of women's experience. And the problem of rape, therefore, was not so much the problem of crime, but the problem of compulsory heterosexuality. The limited gender roles available to people in a given society, limitations enforced by economic and legal conditions of dependency, codified in such structures of the law as marriage. Police, as enforcers of the law, were not going to be the solution. Instead, what was needed was a cultural transformation of gender itself, beginning with the institution of the family. This shift in genres is important not just because acquaintance rape is statistically more common than stranger rape, which is true, but because acquaintance rape can explain stranger rape, but not vice versa. The stranger in the alley is an intensification in degree, but not a difference in kind, in in how patriarchy ordinarily teaches male privilege, which is to say stranger rape and in turn the law and order issue are embedded in the larger structure of ordinary patriarchy. Whereas you couldn't embed patriarchy within just a kind of structure of individual perversion, for instance. In the second half of my talk today, I want to look at works of art that are aimed, like feminists in the 1970s, at shifting genres of sexual violence. But they shift to yet a third genre that has been under-theorized in our discussions. And they do so not through the storytelling associated with consciousness-raising groups, but with the abstract visualization of structures of sexual violence. These more recent works of art are, in other words, like the 1970s feminists in their shifting of genres, but whereas the feminists in the 1970s wrapped up stranger rape within family rape, the works of art I'll be looking at are going to wrap up family rape within what I'll call state rape. And this is just a little bit of a preview of where this argument will be going. That is, these works make a further move to say that acquaintance rape is itself embedded in larger structures of ordinary state violence, for which the prison, rather than the bedroom, provides a paradigmatic scene. This, too, is a statistical matter. Rape is orders of magnitude more common in state detention than outside it. And agents of the state, such as police officers and ICE agents, are orders of magnitude more likely to be domestic abusers. But more importantly, it is, as it was for radical feminists, not only a statistical matter, but a theoretical matter. State violence, we will see, explains heteronormative, ordinary acquaintance rape, but not vice versa. Consider, to begin with, the work of London-based Palestinian artist Mona Hatoum, an internationally recognized sculptor and installation artist. Hatoum's 2002 work, Greater Divide, is a huge steel cheese grater. About 6.5 feet tall, it is scaled to the size of the human, and suggests that the human, rather than the block of cheese, is the object that's going to be grated. But the danger of the grater is also a matter of perspective. From a distance, it's still the familiar domestic object it is. It's even a little cute, I would say. But it's only as you get closer that you start to worry about your body. And this spatial dynamic stages an allegory of domestic violence. Not just because this is literally a domestic object that's been made violent, but because you only see that violence once you're close to it, once you're in an intimate relationship with this object. The Greater Divide in turn suggests a relationship that may look peaceful from the outside, but it's deadly when you're actually in it. And because the grater looks like a shoji screen or a room divider, that you might kind of get undressed behind to change your clothes for privacy, this domestic violence also takes on a specifically sexual association, pointing to intimate partner rape. Importantly, however, Hatoum is not giving us an interpersonal intimate relationship itself, but the stage for that relationship, the domesticity associated with the grater or the shoji screen. Rather than go interrogate possible actors in a scene, we're left with an analysis of the scene itself, the logics and environments that script possible actors' interaction for them. We're expelled from psychological inquiry about actors and into structural inquiry about how the stage has been set for them. The stage Hatoum has set here is not just a domestic scene. The divide also restages a border between Israel and Palestine, alluding to the West Bank barrier that Israel had begun to construct on appropriated Palestinian land 2 years earlier in 2000. This divide does not just separate nations, but racialize people, much how the United States' more heavily fortified walls of Mexico, but not Canada, betray its own racial motivations for segregation. In turn, Hatoum's Greater Divide conflates intimate violence, referenced by the domestic nature of the object, with state violence, referenced by the divide as a kind of border. Hatoum's Greater Divide, by using a domestic object as a violent border, suggests that the closer we get to a racial border, the more we might expect a form of violence we had previously associated with domestic violence. There is, in other words, a dialectical exchange here. Hatoum both reframes domestic violence as a form of state violence, and reframes state violence, especially at borders, as a kind of domestic violence. For instance, calling attention to the high rates of rape in state border detention. Just as radical feminists had earlier called attention to acquaintance rape, which was invisible in the dominant genre of stranger rape, Hatoum calls attention to genres of state rape that are invisible in domestic violence. These include prison rape, Strip searches at customs and border control, family separation at ICE detention, rape in prison. In prison, rape is significantly more common than rape outside, usually perpetrated by guards and other agents of the state, at least according to statistics that have been mandated ever since the Prison Violence Elimination Act was enacted in 2003. And at customs and border control, customs agents are legally allowed to examine sexual organs for contraband, a statistically much more common form of sexual assault than stranger rape. And strip searches are clearly on Hatum's mind, again, because of that conflation of the shoji screen as something we get undressed behind, and this kind of border that you have to pass through to get from one state to another. At the same time, just as feminists earlier said that stranger rape was embedded in ordinary patriarchy, Hatum suggests that ordinary patriarchy is embedded in state population control. For instance, the institutions of patriarchy, like marriage and the family, are completely administered by the state. Marital tax breaks and inheritance law make it hard to leave certain family arrangements, including abusive relationships. Hatum had explored this dialectic between state and domestic violence in another work a couple years earlier. In Sous Tension, which translates to electrified, and I don't speak French, so I apologize to those in the room who do, Hatum littered a table and floor with kitchen utensils. The utensils are connected by a live electric wire, so if you picked one up, you're going to get electrocuted. Once more, the closer we get to the domestic scene, the more dangerous it gets. But importantly, this source of harm, the electricity, often goes unremarked. Electricity is one of those things you can't really see, you just see its effects, right? You don't see the current of electrons, you see the light turning on. And because you only see the objects, you don't see the infrastructure that brings electricity into them. But electricity does require social infrastructure. Before it pops up automatically, literally at the flip of a switch, it was first made by generators, most often subsidized by taxes, transmitted through government-regulated transformers and transmission lines that crisscross nation-states and regional grids, received by a more local substation that lowers the voltage for distribution, and eventually wired through building service panels and outlets. You can simply flip on a switch because of the elaborate state structures that came before it. In this way, Hatum makes the violence of domestic violence not so much an effect of the domestic, but of the interface between the domestic and the state. This scene is literally charged with a danger literally empowered by the state. The harm through electricity also connects the charged domestic objects with state violence in another context. Electricity as a weapon of war, particularly with a long track record of colonial suppression. As I mentioned, Hatum's of Palestinian descent, but she was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and has lived in London ever since the Lebanese Civil War left her exile. But the French of Sous Tension and the fact that this installation was first installed in France, in Paris, might remind us of France's prior colonization, not only of Lebanon, but also because of the prominence of electricity, Algeria. In another colonial conflict, France's war with Algeria in the late 1950s, electrical torture was a particularly popular, even favorite method of the French military. Frantz Fanon devotes an entire section of Wretched of the Earth, one of the classic texts of decolonial theory. He devotes an entire section of that text to torture by electricity, drawing on psychiatric research of torture survivors. Many of his Algerian patients, formerly detained by French forces, were subjected to interrogations conducted exclusively with electricity. And the tool that was most often used for this kind of shock torture was the so-called Jejene, or talker telephone, after the Arkansas prison, named that after the Arkansas prison in which it was first invented. And this utilized power through pedaling. So even in the Algerian mountains, where you don't have wired electricity, you can still produce electricity through the manual bicycling. On this slide, you can see on the left a Jejene, and on the right, a close-up of one of the kitchen grinders in Sous Tension. Kitchen grinders are a favorite of Mona Hatum's. She also, just like she made these giant steel cheese graters, she also loved to make giant steel kitchen grinders. So you can see that they're like 10, 20 feet tall even, and they kind of tower over you. It's very imposing when you see them installed. There's a clear visual echo between these two, with 3 legs supporting a core structure attached to a lever. The torture device usually applied electrical currents to genitalia, particularly the penises of people deemed enemy combatants. But in general, this would fall out of our cultural genres of rape, because even when rape is defined in gender-neutral terms, it is always defined by the state as an act of penetration. So an assault of the penis never qualifies as rape in almost any legal or public health definition. What I want to emphasize here is not the basic point, although it's true, that people with penises can be raped too, but the more structural point that the exclusion of the penis as a site of injury has hidden from view one of the places where rape is most common. It's colonial sites of state detention and interrogation. To return again to the greater divide, a form of violence we have more often associated with the domestic, because it's sexual, becomes more prevalent the closer we get to a racial border. Colonialism remains a specter in sous tension, not just because of the visual echo with electrical instruments of colonial torture, however. The installation also alludes to contemporary transnational circuits of neo-colonial exchange. The mess of this domestic scene, the absence of people in the installation to clean it up, alludes to the increasing outsourcing of domestic labor to migrant populations, an infrastructural support that, like electricity, is often offstage, not readily visible. When the Black feminist abolitionist scholar Angela Davis began her own consideration of the intersection of racial and gender violence in 1975, to return us to the 70s again, she considered how sexual violence in the afterlife of slavery had found itself paradigmatically located in the scene of domestic work. It's not a coincidence that domestic workers, disproportionately women of color and migrants from developing nations, are disproportionately victims of sexual violence. So far, we've looked at a couple works of art from Khartoum that help us better understand some of these larger structural forces that produce victimization. But in the second half of this talk today, I want to ask what would happen if the rape victim fought back with an aggression of their own in the face of this structure of violence. And that's the question explored by the Philippine sculptor Nikki Luna. Beginning in 2010, Nikki Luna has made multiple series of firearms cast in resin and infused with lace. The objects are usually installed in light boxes, illuminating the lace through the clear plastic. So this is an example of one from that series. So this is, I think you can kind of see the kind of flowery lace that is actually what's kind of the material from which this gun is built. A recurring inspiration for this series has been military histories of land dispossession and exploited farm labor in the Philippines. For instance, this work from 2012, which casts resin in molds made off of M14 rifles, previously the standard issue rifle of the United States military, and then widely distributed to the armed forces of the Philippine National Police. The rifles represented for Luna the 2004 massacre of farmers and union leaders at Hacienda Luisita, a sugar plantation in the heartland of the populous island of Luzon. Long a central feature in the Spanish and then American colonial sugar markets before being co-opted by Philippine politicians in 1957, Hacienda Luisita had, in the first half of the 20th century, contributed as much as 20% of the U.S.'s sugar supply. Under President Aquino in the late 80s, who inherited the hacienda, landowners were obliged to distribute not land, but stock to their farmers. The 2004 massacre arose in response to a mass strike organized by union leaders and calling for better farmers' wages and land reform. Labor Secretary Patricia Tomas dispatched police and military forces to the area in November, and they killed at least 7 and injured 121 protesters, and apparent assassinations of peasant leaders commenced in the following months. In 2012, when Luna exhibited this series of M14s made from lace, the Philippine Supreme Court was finishing deliberations that would eventually authorize redistribution of land to farmers through a lottery system. In later works, the sugar industry has continued to crystallize for Luna the fate of peasant exploitation in the Philippines. Her Tiempos Muertos, Dead Season, Shown at the Singapore Biennale was a massive installation of diamonds made from sugar. This is all made from sugar. An ironic commentary on the bitterness of the exploited labor that harvested the sweet commodity. The title, Dead Season, refers to the period from June to September, when seasonally contracted farmers are out of work, a period that threatens to become permanent as global sugar prices fall. Even more so, farm labor has represented for Luna what she calls the twin battles or multiple burdens of women in farming communities. As she says, quote, "The woman peasant farmer who tends to labor-intensive farming chores, comes home to cook, wash the dirty laundry, take care of the children, serve the equally exhausted husband, and so much more. She's tired herself, but times are hard, and the family is hungry. She just has to take on the roles of provider and caregiver." This exploitation of reproductive labor, the labor of raising a family, and its attendant gendering of violence is intensified by the seasonal contractualization of productive labor. As she explains, these companies take them on a contractual basis to discourage workers from forming labor unions. The men laborers are exploited, the women laborers are sexually harassed. At the first International Forum on Feminicide and Ethnic Racialized Groups, which was convened in Colombia in April 2016, Silvia Federici connected violence against women and violence against communities, violence that busts unions and fights capitalism's counterinsurgency. I'll read this rather long quote because it will be important for understanding Nicolina's work. We're witnessing an escalation of violence against women, especially Afro-descendant and indigenous women, due to the fact that globalization is a political project of recolonization. It is intended to give capital uncontested control over the world's natural wealth and human labor, and this cannot be achieved without attacking women, who are directly responsible for the reproduction of their communities. By clearing large territories of their inhabitants, by forcing people to abandon their houses, their fields, and their ancestral lands, violence against women is a crucial part of the operations of the mining and petroleum companies that today are displacing scores of villages across the world. Federici, as some of you might know, was one of the original organizers of the International Wages Against Housework campaign in the 1970s. So you can tell I really love activism from the 1970s. Which, like the more recent international women's strikes, sought not only to valorize reproductive labor as labor, but to abolish it. As she said, in struggling for more wages, the wage worker challenges his social role, but remains outside it, within it. When the struggle for wages for housework happened, we were struggling unambiguously and directly against our social work. So to imagine somebody being paid for doing laundry in their home is to also reimagine what it would mean to be a homemaker. In her 2012 collection of essays, Revolution at Point Zero, Federici argues that today, the colonial frontier is the ongoing capitalization of agriculture under the auspices of World Bank development projects. For instance, by introducing new crops, technologies, and imported food, the integration of African countries into the global economy replaced subsistence farming, a non-capitalist use of land, with farming for profit. Throughout the world, women make up the bulk of subsistence farmers. And because women have also been the main supporters of a non-capitalist use of natural resources and subsistence-oriented agriculture, they have stood in the way of the full commercialization of nature and the destruction of what Federici calls the last remaining commons. It therefore follows, Federici says, that globalization in all its capitalist forms, structural adjustments, trade liberalization, low-intensity warfare, is in essence a war against women. A war that is particularly devastating for women in the third world, but undermines the livelihood and autonomy of proletarian women in every region of the world, including in advanced capitalist countries. The militant symbology of Luna's sculptures underlines this war on women, at the same time that it also points to modes of resisting or fighting it. The lace that is illuminated in Luna's resin casts of M14s is usually torn from wedding dresses and other garments of women, including union leaders in the Hacienda Luisita struggle. This meeting of the material, this lace, with the form of the rifle, stages a crisscrossing of violence where racialized capital meets heterosexuality. In her 2015 Multiple Burdens show, which refers again to that multiple exploitation of women both within the field and in the workplace, or within the home and in the workplace or on the field, included a ceramic cast of an actual pelvis of a female laborer, dug up by Luna with the family's permission and hand-painted with lilies. On the wall behind it, a white neon sign simply read, "Labor." This, for Luna, is the death that labor brings, especially when a contemporary global regime of capital, figured by the generic font and neon light of labor, meets the feudal social arrangements figured by the buried bone. At the same time that feminized symbols aim to prettify it, one of capital's strategies of softening exploitation, just as women's work is often dressed up as selfless sacrifice, as opposed to exploitation. But in addition to staging violence, Luna's rifles also figure the feminized peasant, because of her double exploitation burden, as a leading figure in the struggle against this form of exploitation. One of her first lace weapons in 2010 was a resin-casted AK-47, and she titled this Rebel Woman. Unlike the M14 with its association with the US military and manufacturing, the Russian-designed AK-47 has long been a symbol of anti-imperialist and guerrilla warfare. Its canonization in visual culture includes its adornment of the flag of Mozambique, modeled after the flag of the Mozambican Liberation Front. To make this gun not of metal, but of lace, is to offer up this symbol of insurgency, of anti-colonial insurgency, as a product of feminized labor. Moreover, because this lace is often torn from the wedding gowns of Luna's friends and compatriots, this insurgency is literally enabled only by the desacralization of the marriage symbol, something particularly provocative in the Philippines, which is the only country besides the Vatican where divorce is illegal. To battle imperialism, Luna seems to say we must first be able to break away from the demands of gender first imposed in the Philippines by the Spanish colonization through the imposition of Catholicism. In other words, torn-up lace is lace that has lost its function. It's lace that can no longer marry a woman. And what's worth emphasizing here is that what's at stake in Luna's decision to form, or more precisely to sculpt, a weapon out of the deforming of this function. This is a weapon of sabotage rather than direct attack. Something that is insistent on sabotaging not just the machines of production, but the machines of reproduction. Because torn-up lace has been discarded by capitalist circuits, to use it as the content that fills up the form of a feminist militant symbol is to suggest a reclamation of materials from the market, a theft that grounds an alternative economy of sharing, mutual aid, and subsistence beyond multinational profiteering. A year after her AK-47 sculpture, Luna wrote an essay titled "The AK-47 is a Woman," first noting that women's prized attributes, low cost, reliable, easy to maintain, were also the same ones usually reserved for women. The woman, give her a home, chores, and children, and she will adapt, as age-old traditions have instinctively guided her. Like the legendary AK-47, the woman's reliability is her best asset. The problem for Luna was that women are weapons, but they don't wield their own firepower. The task, as she meant to figure in her sculptures, was to reclaim insurgency as the ground of the feminine. We hold the bullets, and yet we willingly let others, our men, our kids, pull our trigger, aiming at their dreams and aspirations. There is then an ambivalence to Luna's sculptures, both an archive of racial global capital's gendered violence and the double labor burden of women in the global South, and a symbol redirecting that violence against itself, replacing bullets with the detritus of marriage to disarm the expropriation machine. Moreover, the ubiquity of the firearm in the global iconography of both capital expanding policing and militia-led insurgency facilitates transnational resonance, particularly for Luna and regions living on in the afterlife of specifically Spanish and then American colonization. I said at the beginning of this talk that this is abstract work. Abstract in the sense that it does not depict rape directly, but aims to visualize larger social structures in which rape is embedded. And in a similar spirit of abstraction, I've moved in my talk today across Filipino, US-Mexican, French-Algerian, and Israeli-Palestinian contexts, not to say they're the same, but instead to suggest the outlines of a solidaristic opposition to states, a movement against sexual violence that is grounded in transnational solidarity because of the instrumental role of states in producing sexual violence. So, Ramona attunes to this. I'll leave you with one last work today that imagines the fight against sexual violence not as a legal matter of law and order policing, and not quite as a familial matter of shifting gender norms, but like in Mona Hatoum's and Nikki Luna's works, a counterinsurgency against the state control of populations. It is the state's control of marriage and families, for instance, that might coerce people into intimate violence in the first place. The Mexican artist Tania Candiani, who was born in Mexico City in 1974, has been documenting movements against sexual violence for the past 2 decades. In one of her earliest works, in 2004, Candiani created a series called Family Protection, which included domestic objects she had turned into battle gear, as well as photographs documenting her wearing them. In one, she wears a metal colander as a helmet, a leather strap added to secure it to her chin. The series also included an installation of dozens of brooms whose handles had been carved into what she called spears. The brooms were attached perpendicular to a wall like a military phalanx, prepared to repel a charging army. This should remind us again of Hatoum's cheese graters. But what both the name and the design of Candiani's own work suggests is the utensils of women's work turned into self-defense. The static spears will only pierce you if you charge at them. And this is a self-defense that is impersonal and collective, whether because Candiani's face is obscured by the helmet in the photographs, or because of the number of spears that constitutes an army. When Family Protection was installed in a 2009 exhibition for the first time in El Paso, Texas, Candiani created a floor mat to accompany the phalanx. It reads, "Exercise your vulnerability." Rather than disavow the dependencies we all have, the universal condition of no one being fully autonomous and all of us needing other people and other things to survive, this was an invitation to turn vulnerability into the ground for newfound collective agency. In their recent book on the force of nonviolence, Judith Butler asked, what if the situation of those deemed vulnerable is, in fact, a constellation of vulnerability, rage, persistence, and resistance that emerges under the same historical conditions? Butler is interested in public interventions, like street protests, that are designed in a way to demonstrate vulnerability, demonstrate both in the sense of showing that one is vulnerable, and in the sense of demonstrating against it, a protest, objecting to it, like at a political demonstration. Candiani spears register this ambivalence by carving a weapon of resistance out of a symbol of women's conscripted domestic labor. And like in a bust realized out of a block of marble, this carving means that the form of resistance was always latent within that domestic labor, working there and waiting to be realized. And in this, Candiani, like the other artists today, shows the vitality of art not just to expand our theorization of the structures that produce sexual violence, but also as a way to plan and strategize a fight against it. Thank you.
I'm happy to bring the mic around for anybody who wants to ask questions. So, questions? Yes, Carrie.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. That was one of the best talks I've seen in a really long time. But my question is, I thought it was really interesting that when you were sort of at the beginning of your talk discussing the different rhetorics or the different vocabularies for understanding sexual violence, and the third one that was derived from 1970s feminism was aesthetic. And you pointed out a lot of that is, like Kate Millett and other feminists are sort of coming out of the literary critical perspective, right? So looking at like H. Lawrence and people like that, which is totally true. And then your objects of analysis are sculptures, which is really great for a talk like this because we can see the sculptures. But I guess I'm wondering, are there particular literary forms or particular contemporary authors who you see doing something analogous to some of these sculptures with like the novel or the poetry, and if you could talk a little bit about like is literature engaging in this kind of like formal way of theorizing sexual violence?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. I think the short answer is yes. I think that one of the things that scholars of novels have taught us is that there's a real interesting tension in novels because on the one hand, they want to give us the stories of psychologically complete human beings, right? The stories of individuals. On the other hand, through that story of the individual, they're trying to give us something like the totality of a society that that individual belongs to. So how do we kind of get both to the individual story and the kind of totality that I think is closer to that social structure that I'm interested in this talk? And I think that there are authors who do that through more experimental means. But I also think that there are authors in something closer to a kind of traditional realist tradition who also do this. So one author that I'm particularly interested in, for instance, is James Baldwin, whose 1974 novel, 70s again, If Beale Street Could Talk, is also about the intersections of state violence and sexual violence. It's about one of the protagonists, Fonnie, is set up by a white police officer who's a black man in Harlem for a sexual assault that he did not commit, and while in prison experiences the threat of sexual violence himself. And that is Baldwin's way of helping to see how the assault of a woman outside of prison, the crime for which Fonnie is set up, is also a part of a larger structure that includes Fonnie's own experience of sexual violence in the prison. So to kind of, again, encapsulate something like the home within the larger theoretical space of prison. I think that novels, especially because as a linguistic medium, are also one of the ways in which we better understand how just the language that we use to talk about gender, about sexuality, again, shapes what we even think sexuality or gender are. And that also remains very important then for the feminist mission of trying to unveil what seems invisible to us at the beginning. But thank you.
Yes.
Please introduce yourself.
Ask a question.
Hi, I'm Adachi. I'm an honors student here and a senior. I loved your presentation and I found the analysis that you did of each work very interesting. It was very cool. I just wanted to know, so it seems like the art that you were highlighting specifically talks a lot about how we can unveil the current problem of sexual violence, but I wondered where you see the role of art in things more along the lines of prevention and the prevention of perpetuating these crimes that continue to happen each year, just education and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here I think that I would especially, thank you for that question, because I think that that's ultimately where we want to be in the kind of sexual violence, the movement against sexual violence is not just being in this kind of reactive position of always trying to catch up with the most recent event and needing to get justice for that, but also trying to get ahead of the problem and think about prevention. I think that I would turn here to some of Nika Luna's work again, and maybe dive a little bit deeper into, for instance, the use of this lace as the material from which this militant symbol is produced. Many of the leading kind of scholars of the gendered exploitation of labor under globalization have actually been specifically interested in lace work as one of the scenes in which that happens. This begins with like Maria Lisa's work in the 80s, for instance, because in a lot of Global South communities, lace work is something that happens kind of both within the home and outside the home. What I think lace represents for Luna is a way of kind of forming an economy that isn't directly referential to the state. So to have kind of networks of sharing, of mutual aid, mutual aid has also, I think, kind of had a newfound attention in the US in the aftermath of the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. If we can kind of create these ways of sustaining each other, subsistence farming, that don't rely upon state infrastructures and the state structures that kind of are the ways by which money is channeled through a society, through marriage, through inheritance, then we might be able to create communities that could be hold themselves accountable, independent of some of the state metrics of policing and criminalization. So I think that the kind of big picture question for prevention for a lot of these artists is something kind of more like communism, frankly. Like needing to have a kind of space outside of capital, because capital is ultimately the kind of origin of aggression, of entitlement, of thinking that you can have somebody else's property as an object. So like that's the big picture thing. But then I think the question always is like, okay, it's great to be able to identify like the radical utopia that we want. That's like a kind of long-term solution. But what can we be doing in the present? And I think in the present, what that looks like in the kind of short term is developing those kind of systems of community accountability that transformative justice advocates have taught us about, where we kind of have these networks of people caring for each other that aren't isolated to the family form, for instance. So imagining communities that cross over households, that cross, that are at the neighborhood level as opposed to the household level is another way of preventing violence, because we have that kind of system of care in place. Thank you.
Yes. Someone please.
Yeah, thanks. My name is Alex Lloyd. I'm an assistant professor in the philosophy department. This was super interesting. Thank you so much. I just had a quick question about the mechanism by which the art kind of helps that shift in that nice table that you had, kind of from the like the initial kind of conceptualization of stranger rape, protected rape to state rape. Like, I guess I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about what exactly it is about the art that kind of allows us to shift from the kind of the genre from one to the other. Like, is it at the level of like our conscious attitudes and beliefs, or is it kind of more at like a subconscious just level of like our emotions and just, I don't know, something maybe like less tangible? I don't know if that makes sense, but I was just
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think that the way I've approached it in this talk is that art is operating at something more like a conscious level, because what these artists are doing is they're doing theory. So one of the things I'm trying to say is that art is itself kind of actively theorizing the world, and therefore trying to claim for something like visual art a task that has often been relegated to something like political theory or philosophy or other kinds of disciplines, including art history. Like, let's leave it to the critics to do the theorizing. I want to say that artworks themselves are kind of actively theorizing these structures. So to the extent that it helps us move from one genre to another, it's just helping us to kind of get some distance from the world that we're inhabiting, to be able to think more about it in an abstract way. That at least is the art that I think that we're looking at today. So it's art that's doing theory, that's working at a conscious level. I think that a lot of contemporary activism around sexual violence, particularly activism that I find really inspiring, beginning in Argentina, and that's spreading throughout the world, where the kind of international women's strikes really got started, was especially in South America. Art was also a real part of kind of constituting the subject of protest. So performance art, street-based art is raising consciousness in that way. And I think that is something that's really important too, is the way in which art can disturb our sense of the world and kind of create a new collective subject that can be political in a mass sphere. I haven't been exploring that as much in this talk or in some of my other research. I think that that's a more kind of sociological, empirical question, like the extent to which art at that kind of performance level is shifting public opinions, is kind of changing unconscious biases. So that's a little bit beyond my disciplinary training, but I think that that's another side of it that's important too.
My name is Stephen. I'm a teacher training here. Thank you for the talk. It was very, very interesting. My question is about going back to vocabularies. And I'm thinking about vocabularies sort of on this interpersonal side, now with the population statistics and so on, and what the aesthetic side, the cultural side. And I think where I'm feeling something that I want to know more of is the personal side. That's to say, like, empowering a personal vocabulary for people that are involved with this. That's to say, maybe like an expressive vocabulary. Is that something that is involved in this matrix at all? Is this something you've been looking at in terms of like giving people the language to externalize their experiences?
I think it is. Thank you for that question. I think that this was especially important for a kind of earlier generation of feminist artists in the 70s and early 80s. It's not a coincidence that kind of sexual violence is being politicized in the US at the same time that a new form of art is also being developed by women, which is performance art. And performance art was, I think, a way for victims and survivors of violence to develop new ways of expressing a trauma that had previously been, not something you could talk about. In the 60s and 70s, if you say PTSD, the kind of subject that you're going to think of is the Vietnam War veteran. Whereas today, I think that when we think of trauma, the first thing that we often think of is the sexual violence survivor. That's a huge cultural shift for which I think feminists and some of this performance art that is giving new voice to trauma is really responsible for. So I think that it's very important to kind of have those modes of personal expression. I think one of the things that art does is it can also relieve the pressure of survivors having to be the ones who are always giving their testimony. Something like the Me Too movement, I need to tell my story of trauma. That often is requiring survivors to be re-traumatized in order to be heard. So maybe art can give a voice that doesn't require the trauma survivor to always rehearse their trauma. That being said, I've been less interested, I admit, in this presentation on the individual level because I worry that sometimes we focus too much on the individual level when it comes to sexual violence. Which is not to say that we should not care about each and every individual and make sure that we're responding with care to each and every survivor. But that when we focus on individuals one story at a time, it's harder to then also think of the larger structure that's at play. And so one of the reasons I've been interested in this kind of more abstract art is because of its way in which we can start thinking about capitalism, for instance, at the same time we're thinking about sexual violence, because of the larger structural picture that is greater than any one individual. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.